Hey, family. Welcome to another episode of Faith on the Journey. If this is your first time tuning in, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here and want you to know that we're committed to helping you strengthen your faith, heal your heart, and discover a sense of community. And we do so through a variety of ways by connecting you with a team of Christian counselors and offering trauma healing groups throughout the year. You can learn about these resources and so much more by visiting our website at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. Now, for today's episode, I'm excited to welcome to the show someone who's going to talk about a topic that I really need to explore more. This is Emily Lewis. She is a worthiness coach who specializes, listen to this, in helping Christians get off the hamster wheel of performance so that they can be confident in their God given identity, that is. Through coaching and her podcast, Abundant Grace, she helps Christians stop trying to prove themselves and instead rest in God. And so we are excited to talk about this topic. But before we do, we're going to talk about something else in terms of her testimony and how she was able to do some healing in her own life. And so we're so excited to have you here, Emily. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I'm honored to be here.
Yes, yes, yes. So I was listening to you share a little bit about your story in our pre-interview, and it's something that I think our audience can definitely learn from in terms of the process that you had to really work through as it relates to spiritual trauma that you had experienced. And so let's start there with your testimony, and then we'll explore other questions after that.
Perfect. Thank you. One of the biggest foundational pieces for how I saw the world was through the foundation of religion, church that I grew up in. And in it, I was told what to believe and what to think about it, how to act, and all hinging on whether or not I would be accepted by people or accepted by God based on whether or not I was performing and doing all of the right things. And that set me up to try to earn acceptance and to prove that I was good enough. And I'm a natural achiever too, so there's some nature and nurture mixed all together there. And I tried really hard to make sure that I was fitting in and measuring up. And I did that for years. And that's the hamster wheel I'm talking about. Like, man, on the days that you get it, on the days that whatever's on your checklist, because we all have some kind of checklist in our head where we're like, if I get this done, then maybe I feel good enough or whatever. On those days, I felt real good and I felt a little bit arrogant because I was goody two shoes and I was better than anybody who might not be because that hamster wheel puts us into comparison too. But then on the days that I didn't, oh, so defeating. Like I couldn't outwork that inner critic. I couldn't outwork the insecurities that maybe I just wasn't enough ever. In that performance, it's exhausting, but I didn't know anything else. And I hadn't yet had the courage to ask questions to say, maybe there's something different because we were the ones that were right. We think we're right. And when it's reinforced by some cultural things in your church too, as like we're the only right ones, questions are scary.
And maybe you're going to talk about this a little bit in terms of your church. So it sounds like there was some stuff happening at your church that was concerning.
Correct. Yeah. So the way my mom describes it, it's like putting a frog, have you heard the story of how to boil a frog? Okay. So a frog, obviously, if you put him in boiling water, he's going to jump out. But if you put him in room temperature water and you just slowly, slowly turn up the heat, that's how you boil a frog. It was kind of like that. So that was my mom's experience raising us in it. Was there were some concerns, but you just this was my own experience too. You just kind of look the other way to abusive or oppressive language, and you assume if you take offense to it, that it just must mean that you're not spiritual enough, and so you stay and you withstand further abuse. And it was actually when the pastor that I grew up under was exposed for being abusive at home that everything started to fall apart. Of course, it was odd and strange, but it was such a gift to be handed a situation where things didn't add up, and it was finally a big enough thing to where I could start asking questions and it felt okay. Like, okay, if this wasn't true, if he wasn't living this, if he wasn't measuring up, if this thing that he said wasn't true, maybe this isn't true. And I started asking all of the questions and examining everything I believed. And in that is where I found God's unconditional love. See, I believed that God loved me because the Bible said so. And the Bible was one of the things that was on my list that I was supposed to believe. So I didn't really understand why I believed it, but I was what I was supposed to do. And then when I started asking questions and God wasn't afraid of them, and I found God to be very comforting and caring, and He no longer was threatening to leave me, or what I thought, because I thought He had been threatening to leave all along if I didn't measure up. But I found His unconditional love there through um, resources and just asking those questions. So, experiencing that for the first time rather than just knowing it, because there's a lot of stuff that we know we're supposed to believe as Christians, but when we experience it, it's a completely different thing.
Absolutely. And it sounds like once your pastor, like what was going on, came to light, uh, it kind of opened up some things for you. God was able to kind of download, if you will, some things into your spirit about what was taking place. And was there some work around your healing from all that? Like, what was that process? Because it was probably some unlearning and deconstructing that took place from the years that you were at that church.
Yes, absolutely. The first piece of healing, of course, we know is awareness, but I didn't have the words to describe it. So part of that first healing was just listening to resources and clicking on blog posts and reading books and listening to podcast episodes and preaching messages that explained spiritual PTSD and explained spiritual abuse and explained religious trauma. And as I learned to accept that, because acceptance is a huge piece where we have to be honest with where we're at, or we're not going to be taking the right medicine, is one of the ways that KJ Ramsey talks about it. And we have to be bold enough to sometimes we need to label things and name them what they were. And that was really powerful and helpful for me in naming the abuse and then realizing that it was a cult like environment and being bold enough to say that's what it was allows us the space and it almost validates it for ourselves where we don't have to have someone else validate our pain or validate what we went through. Not we need other people to come around us, but when someone else maybe is dismissive towards what you've been through, you are honoring your own pain. You're honoring what you went through, and you can meet yourself right there. You can allow God to meet you right where you're at. Because there's so much in us where we think we need to be somewhere else or what we are supposed to be. You know, there's this feeling of like, I should be further ahead. I should have this figured out. Why do I even have this question? I shouldn't be struggling with this. And if we can learn to just meet God right where we're at, in the pain and naming the pain is has been and it continues to be super helpful for me.
That's very helpful as well for our audience. And so I appreciate you sharing that. And I would love for you to go into a little bit more detail about defining what spiritual trauma or PTSD is for someone who might be listening to this and you might be kind of walking down their aisle and they're like, wait a minute, this is sounding a little familiar. Can you define that for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that. I'll give you two definitions of religious trauma that you might relate with. And the first one is when you have an inner critic inside of your mind and you assume that that demeaning, nagging voice is what God sounds like. And we get the idea that that's who he is. And that can come from spiritual abuse. That can come from having other people speak into our lives and tell us that they're speaking on God's behalf and they might be speaking down to you and treating you like you're worthless and teaching you that you're worthless. And then we internalize those messages and assume that that's who God is. Another way to describe religious trauma I think J.S. Park is the one who said it this way, or he was quoting someone when I read it, when he said it. But it's like having a haunted house, and the ghost haunting the house is God, is what religious trauma can feel like, where you're not sure what you're supposed to trust. And when you're taught to distrust your own intuition to begin with, because systems of power thrive on people not having their own agency. They thrive on people not having their own autonomy and their own intuition and their own ability to hear from Holy Spirit. You'll see in a lot of oppressive systems, from a religious standpoint, either a complete under appreciation of Holy Spirit, and it's just rules and it's legalism and it's everybody, we have our formula, we know exactly what we're supposed to do. And the Holy Spirit, the only way he speaks to us is by quoting us a Bible verse and driving us back to the Bible. And that is true, but he does speak and is alive today. Or we can see on the opposite end, where sometimes this Holy Spirit is maybe overemphasized, and people can use that and weaponize that against people and say, the Holy Spirit told me for you, or, God told me for you. And we have to be careful in places where we are being told what God is saying through another person. The way that my pastor now, so spoiler alert, I did find a healthy community after that. But the way that my pastor says it now is that it's not my job to tell you what God said. And that sometimes we go, wait a second, it's not. He said, no, it's my job to help you hear God's voice for yourself. And that's such a different approach to Christianity, to helping people grow and be stronger in their relationship with God, when we teach them that they have direct access to God and there's not something special in someone else's role in your life.
I'll never forgive you for what you did to me.
I feel so dirty.
I just don't know who I am anymore.
I can't believe I'll never see him again. I've got to be strong for my family.
I can't let him see me cry.
What happens in this house stays in this house.
I can't take this anymore. I feel like I'm living my entire life behind a mask.
The mask is the keeper of secrets and master of illusions. It despises authenticity, fears transparency, and knows no vulnerability. The mask will stop at nothing to keep its image intact and emotions at bay. In its simplest form, the mask is the facade we project to the world. But what is hidden in the dark will come to light. Even if we master the art of wearing the mask, the pain that we've buried has the power to hold us captive in the shackles of shame, anger, and despair. But there is power greater than our pain, greater than our past, and greater than what the world says about us. There is a God who can heal us from our pain and can free us from defining our values based on the world's standards. There is hope, and you can embark on your journey towards freedom by reading the book Breaking the Power of the Mask by author and motivational speaker Jocelyn Jones. Discover the joy and healing that rightfully belongs to you. No more shame, no more fear, and no more hiding behind the mask.
I'm breaking the power.
I'm breaking the power.
I'm breaking the power of the mask.
Get your copy today by visiting breakingthemask.com.
When someone has experienced spiritual trauma and they have been hurt by the church, they can be tempted to just say, forget the church. I'm over it. I'm done. I don't know if you felt like that at some point, and if so, how did you work through it to help someone else who might be in the same situation?
Yeah, I would say for me, this is not everyone's experience. So having so much grace for people who come at this from different angles. But for me, it was such a stark contrast between how God met me and how the people in my life were treating me in the religious system in that church. So the contrast was so shocking that it became easy to understand the difference and to not throw feel like throwing Jesus out with it. But that, again, that's not everyone's experience. Sometimes it feels like God abandoned you in that too. So making grace and space for that. But understanding his unconditional love was so shocking and so different. It was so freeing. It was getting rid of that list of rules and asking God what he had for my life. It was breaking out of boxes, like being a stay-at-home mom and being a homemaker and being the things that I felt like I should be, things he's had me step into, whether it's preaching or owning a business and coaching. And there's things that have shifted and changed. And those were so freeing and available to me when God's love was the foundation. When we stop trying to prove our worth and we operate from our worth, that's where ultimate confidence comes from. And then healing after religious trauma and learning also how to trust people again is its own ball of wax. It is a task. But God has been very gracious and kind in giving us a community that loves us well. And even I can still get anxious about it. I can still feel triggered by things that are said. And I'm still learning. I'm still learning how to trust people again. But learning to trust God was great. He was so gracious. And I'll give you one example. When we think about surrender, now surrender is a big topic, and so is trusting God. But if we can stop looking at trusting God as a ultimatum, like God is standing over us telling us, you better trust me. I've got this. Why wouldn't you trust me? And instead he's like, hey, I'm right here with you. You can trust me. I'm not asking you to, I'm not demanding you trust me. I'm here. I'm willing to build a relationship with you, and I'm willing to teach you that I'm trustworthy, one thing at a time. And then we can start unclenching our hands around the things that we're holding and stop being so afraid of letting him have those. Because I had this picture in my mind, and I know I'm not alone, where I was trying to surrender other people, but it could be anything else. You could be surrendering God's purpose. You could be surrendering your own plans. You could be surrendering something, a situation. And I had my hand so tightly wrapped around it. And I was afraid that if I opened up my hand, that God was going to snatch it out and say, ha, gotcha, was how it felt like God was going to do. And as I slowly learned to open my hand, what I found was that God wasn't ready to snatch things out. And if he did ask me to take things out, it was because he wanted to pour more in. So when we want to open up our hands and change that perception of who God is, that he's not harsh, that he's not distant, we can open up our hands and learn to receive when we stop trying to work for something that he's just trying to give us.
Such a beautiful illustration there. And I think that we all need that reminder sometimes. And it's very difficult, especially when we've been hurt and we operate from a place of just wanting to protect ourselves and not be let down by others, let alone God. And so knowing that God is trustworthy, and just as you mentioned several times, grace, extending ourselves grace, because it's not easy to surrender, but God thankfully is so patient with us. I thank God that he's patient. So
Yes, he
yeah.
is.
And so when you talk about the process of renewing your mind, essentially, from being able to capture the thoughts that might have been implanted by those around you, your environment, Satan loves to drop certain things in our spirit. And so how do you capture those thoughts and go through the process of renewing our mind from those things that really try to take away from the identity that God has given us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So sometimes, like you said, those thoughts come in, and sometimes we catch them right away. Sometimes it's really obvious, and we go, I had a thought a few months ago that was like, who are you to be doing this? And immediately I was like, excuse me. I don't even know where that thought came from, but I know that it's wrong. And those are the places we want to get, is when we are sure that that thought is not from God, that it is not true about who we are. But the ones that are tricky are the ones that we entertain, or the ones that we're not sure if they might be true. And we have, neural pathways in our brain that we're used to going down, that are well forged paths towards um, maybe negative self talk, or beating ourselves up. And once you find yourself wherever you wake up along that trail, like you said, have grace. We can have grace for ourselves and go, wait a second. I'm down this path of beating myself up and talking down to myself, and I want to go a new direction. And when we catch those thoughts, then we can try to create new paths in our brain. And it takes time and it takes energy and effort of speaking truth. So you can start with some declarations of who God says you are. You can start with some Bible verses. You can start with some breath prayers. That's a gentle way to do it. You can start with I am statements. Like if you're feeling really low and you know that you're in a negative, beating yourself up spot, and you want to renew your mind, I challenge you to write out on a piece of paper, I am statements. And this is hard for us when we're used to just looking at how terrible we are. Maybe we're not worthy and we want to take care of other people over ourselves. And maybe we prioritize other things, or we only find worth and value for achieving or succeeding. Writing down a page of, I am worthy of love. I am deserving of care. I am kind. I am beautiful. I am an overcomer. Like those things can be hard at first, but I challenge you to start. I challenge you to write 5 things down that you are and speak that declaration of God's truth over yourself so that you can create new pathways in your brain. Even on the days where you're feeling good, repeat those. On the days you're feeling like, I don't believe those, repeat those over yourself, and you can begin to create new tracks and new patterns for yourself to follow. And then you can start to believe new beliefs, because this is the real work, right? We have to get down to the root of what belief is there. And this might be where you want to bring in a counselor, you want to bring in a coach, you want to bring in a trusted resource to help you in your journey. Is some of those beliefs about ourselves, we're not sure if they're true. Maybe I am not cut out for this. Maybe I am supposed to quit. And we need somebody else to come in and be the hands and feet of Jesus in our lives and pour belief onto us. We see so many examples of this in my life or in the Bible, where other people came alongside and supported each other. We need that. We're not supposed to be doing this alone. But when we've been hurt in community, it's really hard to ask other people to support us. But we have to find the people that we're safe to be ourselves with. And the only way to find them is to be true to who we are. But then they can pour belief on us for the days that we don't believe it. So there's multiple ways that we can do that. And then leaning on other people to help us form new beliefs and get to the bottom of why we're doing what we're doing, why we're believing what we're believing.
Yes, I could not agree more. And I love what you said around the community piece. We were made for relationship. And, sometimes it's difficult to open up and find people that you can trust and be open and honest with. But, stick your toe out there and, see slowly but surely if you have the help of a counselor. But also, just in certain circles, I always like to take this approach. You don't have to air everything outright with people. Like if you join a small group, or, you start engaging a new friend group, slowly but surely you engage and you observe and you ask God for discernment on who you can actually share and be open with. But in those moments, the intimacy and being cared for and seen, and people knowing you and loving you for who you are, and you don't have to just show up and pretend, that is something that's freeing. And we just don't want to have to continue to go through life pretending and not being honest about what we need, who we are, and how we feel.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a Timothy Keller quote, which I didn't see until this last month, when a lot of people were posting quotes of his after he passed away a couple of weeks ago. But there is a quote that he said something to the effect of, it's nice to be loved for, just just loved, but not authentic. But he said, our deepest fear is to be known and not loved. So we can be loved but not known, but our deepest fear is to be known and then rejected. So to be loved, to be known and loved is the greatest thing that we have. And God extends that to us more than anyone else. And then when we learn to be self-aware, when we learn to heal, the next person that learns to accept us is us. And we have to accept us right where we're at. And then it allows other people to know and love us as well. And it, of course, it's not like a step-by-step thing. It's all happening, all tangled up together, and it's not neat and tidy. But um, when the love of God is the well that we're drawing from to accept ourselves, because if He is so holy and incredibly perfect and knows everything, and He can accept us and love us and be patient and faithful and just, then we can accept ourselves right where we're at also.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that quote. I'm going to hold on to that. And I think that gives us just great perspective. And I would love just to spend a little bit of time before we end our interview together, just exploring that hamster wheel that you help people to get off. So for someone who is either on the hamster wheel, the performance wheel, the perfection wheel, I think you kind of dabble in all those areas. How do you help them to adjust, to stop that cycle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all about our foundational beliefs, really. When we so I don't think I overviewed it completely, but what happens is we try to outwork our inner critic, or we try to outwork our insecurities by being perfect, by getting it just right, by achieving, by staying quiet, by staying loud and being too busy. And we each have our own little coping mechanism that we tend to use. Each of us have a different tendency to try to quiet this inner critic. And then it works sometimes. Like that fear of being seen, that fear of failure, that fear of getting it wrong, it works and it motivates us, and we get to the top and we feel like we achieved. And that works until one of two things happens. We're no longer getting the results, or we're just exhausted and we stop doing the thing. And then we travel down the hamster wheel to the bottom, where we're just defeated. And we then believe the lie about ourselves. We believe that we just won't ever be enough. We continue to believe that our achievements are our value, and that if we're not measuring up and doing things, then we're not good enough. And then what happens next is we decide to try harder again. We muster ourselves back up and we say, I'm going to give it another go. I fell off that diet, like that bandwagon. I'm going to give it another go. It's the first of the month. It's another Monday, or whatever it is. Maybe it's a diet, or I think that's just super relatable, but it can be a spiritual practice or anything new that we want to establish. And instead, what we have to do is we have to break our agreement with that. And one of the ways we do that is by quitting something. You have to get off of the wheel, and you won't ever find peace through the achievement, because the achievement, even if you're achieving it, it's a facade. So you have to get off of it. And that might look like quitting something that's good, even if it's not the best thing for you. If it's not serving you in this season, you should stop saying, I should just be doing this, and let it go and release it. And maybe you'll pick it back up in another season. Maybe you'll pick up that spiritual practice, or that way you're doing your business, or that habit, or whatever. You'll pick it up in a different season. But if it's become performative for you, you should stop. And then you can remind yourself, almost through like exposure therapy, to just rest and just be and create margin for yourself. And I will say, resting is so vulnerable. We don't like to be alone with our thoughts, most of us. It's scary to say, I'm going to stop and I'm just going to rest in the hustle culture that we live in. It's so It's crazy to say I'm taking a Sabbath. We hardly even know what a Sabbath is anymore. But if we can make ourselves say no, or we can make ourselves rest, that's one of the great ways that we can get off of that performance hamster wheel, is just forcing ourselves to stop. And then back to what I said a little bit earlier about changing our beliefs. We have to get down to the root of those beliefs, and we can speak truth to those. We can get a coach to help us overcome those. But those two pieces are huge for shifting how we're showing up in the world.
Yes, wow, and I know some people who are listening right now, it just makes them feel uncomfortable even hearing the idea of taking a Sabbath and resting. They might be getting the shakes right now as they listen to us, but it's hard, but it's real, and I think for me, I struggle with this as well, and we feel like we can't let certain things go. If we didn't do something, we failed, and before we know it, we work ourselves to a place of exhaustion, and there's this one movement that I've heard about. It's called the Nap Ministry, I believe. And they talk about rest being a form of resistance. And I'm like, wow, like resistance against a system that tells us that we have to work ourselves to the ground. And so that paradigm shift is something that I think we have to lean into, and it might be difficult to do, but how I look at it like this: when you are at a place where you are not operating on fumes and just constantly on empty, how effective, how much more can God really use you in a powerful way? And so the hamster wheel, at some point, we got to just let that thing roll down the street and,
Yep,
and be in a
yep.
place where we're okay with saying, I've done enough. I'm doing what God has called me to do in this season. That is enough. And I love what you said. One last thing in terms of achievements, right? Because those of us who are very goal oriented and performance driven, we're always reaching for this new castle on the hill. So, yes, we accomplished one thing, check it off the list. Okay, what's the next? And what's the next? And just moving, moving, moving. And it's kind of like, okay, are you ever going to be satisfied? And that's where the trick. That's where the
Yeah,
trick
it
comes.
is.
Because we don't even take the moment to celebrate, because we're always trying to get to the next. It's just it's such a game, a cycle. It's crazy as I talk about it,
Mhm.
right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many different ways to learn to stay present in the moment and remember that God is with us. And we can use things like all five of our senses. We were given five senses, and so many of us, I'm guilty of this, where I only think about what I see, and I need to slow down and enjoy what I hear and what I taste and what I smell and what what I'm touching, what it feels like, and we can be present in the moment. This morning, just this morning, I almost left the house without eating breakfast. I was like, "Oh, I have a meeting." I had a meeting at 7 this morning, and I had a bunch of tasks to do, and I had to, I just had stuff to do, right? And it was very important. And I mean that seriously. It was important, but so is taking care of me and slowing down. So I made myself breakfast and I made myself sit down. And in that, God gave me two questions to ask. He's like, "How can you slow down? How can I slow down?" And that doesn't mean that we have to stop doing what we're doing. It might. But how can I slow down and just be present? And then the second question is, how can I be aware of God's presence? And it comes back to that for me because he's never threatening to leave. He's never like, "Well, you messed up today," or "You're not quite enough." We have that level of security and safety. And when we think about attachment science and learning to take risks and be confident, we have to know that our Heavenly Father will always be there for us. That when we go out and do something, like He's with us, He's not um, away from us. And we have that safety and security and that belonging. And that is what fuels us to keep doing. And that's what fuels us to just rest and be. So you can even, I mentioned breath prayers. You can even turn that question into a breath prayer and just inhale, "I am safe," or inhale, "How can I slow down?" or inhale, "Slow down," and exhale, "God is with me," and carry that, the awareness of his presence with you. And then you can heal and you can love well and you can rest well and you can take action well. And all of that will help us in our achieving to rest and to celebrate just the mundane, everyday moments that we're probably missing.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Emily, I wish we had more time to talk about this, but before I let you go, you have a course and you're helping people out in their area. Briefly talk about your course and where people can find you.
Thank you for asking. I really appreciate that. So you can go to my website, emilykluis.com. So that's Emily, the letter K, Louis.com /connected to learn specifically about the course. And it is for you if you want to refresh your relationship with God and you want to press into your relationship with yourself, really meeting God right where you're at, not where you're supposed to be, not where you should, but really just finding what works for you, because you can be confident in what works for you rather than stuck in comparison of what works for so and so, or what you should be doing, or what this denomination says, or what this church implies you should be doing. Like, just meet God right where you're at and learn that acceptance for yourself that flows from God. And then you can also hear more from me on my podcast, Abundant Grace. So I've been podcasting there for a few years now. So there's a plethora of episodes to choose from, all around grace and relationship with God, worthiness, and then confidently stepping into everything God has for you.
Amazing. Emily, thank you so much for being on the show. Blessings to you in your important ministry as you help people to know who they are as a child of God, and to break that bondage that they might be in, and whether it's the hamster wheel or spiritual trauma. And so I just thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I appreciate you. And I love the powerful ministry that you have, helping people heal and grow and be thriving in the abundant life that Jesus came to give us.
Oh, thank you, Emily. I appreciate that. Thank you for being here. And I thank you all for tuning into today's episode. We learned some good nuggets. There were some notes I was taking for myself too today, and I plan to apply. But if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a 5-star review and share this episode with a friend. And if you are looking for a Christian counselor, you can find out resources on our website at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. So that's it for this week, family. Thank you again for tuning in. And until next time, you keep your faith on the journey.